We're doing good, bro. I pretty much just react to stuff, and I get no copyright claims or anything. I must admit, the copyright claims are not copyright strikes, y'all. If you get a copyright strike, you're doing something bad. Like I say, if you probably you like recorded wrestling while it's live, not it's live and it's going on. Yeah, that's probably copyright worthy, copyright strike worthy. But if you was just watching like a WWE match, I feel like that would just be a copyright claim. Your video will probably get taken down, but the video will probably stay on the channel. Or it would turn into the you can't this video was taken down type of thing. But anyways, I wanna let's see until I'm trying to see what I wanted to watch. I wanted to this is who is demoted from world champs to mid-card titles. Let's see what they talking
Usually,
about
when
here.
a wrestler reaches the main event level, their days of challenging for mid-card titles are over. After all, the purpose of those belts are by and large to elevate younger performers and get them to the higher tier. That said, there are occasions when a performer has reached the mountaintop and then ventured back down again, either to help build someone else up or to recover some of their own lost momentum. But what are the biggest examples of this happening in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with arguably the greatest mid-card title run from a main eventer, John Cena's time as United States champion in 2015. Yes, prior to big match John winning the gold from Rusev at WrestleMania 31, the United States title had never really had much value in WWE, as it was usually slotted a rung below even the Intercontinental strap in the pecking order. But all that changed when the West Newbury native put it around his waist, because from there, he'd go on to have one of the best title runs of the modern day, something that can compete with Gunther's current run with the IC belt. How did he do this? Good. Well, by hosting an open challenge each and every week, which saw him put on some of the best matches of his career as he helped to raise the stock of the likes of Cesaro, Sami Zayn, and Kevin Owens. That's right, not only did this elevate the title into something that, for a while, was approaching the importance of the world title, but it also elevated everyone who fought over it, Cena included. Hell, this was the point where the decade-plus long round of boos the champ received everywhere he went started to dissipate, as people took on a whole new appreciation for him and what he could do in the ring. So for that reason alone, you could argue this was more successful than any of his 16 runs with the top prize when it came to getting him over. But John Cena wasn't the only person returning to the mid-card in order to try to elevate a title in 2015, because as that was happening, Daniel Bryan was doing the exact same thing with the Intercontinental Gold. Sure, this one didn't have the same effect in the long run, as Bryan's injuries meant he'd have to retire before he could really get going here. That said, the very fact he'd even won the belt at all was a sign of how serious WWE were about trying to revive its fortunes. Hell, this was the man who only 1 year before had beaten Triple H, Randy Orton, and Batista all on the same night in order to become WWE World Heavyweight Champion in the main event of WrestleMania 30. So when at the following year's Showcase of the Immortals, he was challenging for the secondary prize in a multi-man ladder match, it was seen as a curious choice to say the least. That said, once it became apparent the purpose here was for the American Dragon to make the belt feel important again, it all made a little more sense. And given how great Bryan is in the ring, this is likely what would have happened had years of head injuries not finally caught up to him and forced him into his first retirement just a few months later. But thankfully that wouldn't mark the end of main eventers going back down the card to try to rebuild the once prized belt, as only a couple of years after this in 2018, Seth Rollins did the same thing when he also became Intercontinental Champion.
Get up to 6 accounts per household and unlimited DVR space included. With YouTube TV. Try it free. Terms apply. Cancel anytime.
Responding to emails takes time, but not with Grammarly. In a few clicks, Grammarly's generative AI drafts professional, relevant replies that sound like you. Download it for free at Grammarly.com.
Forgotten about this one? We wouldn't blame you if you had, because it came sandwiched right in between world title runs for the Architect. That said, as arguably the best in-ring wrestler in WWE today, Seth Rollins has never needed the top prize to prove he's the top guy, and this was something he showed when he won the IC strap for the first time in a triple threat bout against Finn Balor and The Miz at WrestleMania 34. Sure, this could have been seen as a step down to some, as 3 years prior to that, he'd been winning the WWE title in the main event of WrestleMania. But as we mentioned a moment ago, it's never been about the gold around Rollins' waist as much as it's been about what he can do once the bell rings. And that's why during his run as IC champ, he had some excellent bouts against the likes of Dolph Ziggler, with this doing a lot to revive the fortunes of the belt. Hell, even when he lost it to the Show-Off in an excellent 30-minute Iron Man match at July 15th's Extreme Rules that year, he'd quickly recover by winning it back again for the second time at SummerSlam a month later. And that also coincided with the first revival of the Shield, too, making this second run arguably even more historically significant. Yes, anytime the Shield were involved in anything in WWE, whether together or as solo acts, you could be sure something special was going to happen. And Seth Rollins wasn't the only one of them who went back down to the mid-card to win a title after having already been world champion, as it happens, because a full 2 years before he did this, Roman Reigns was doing it with the United States title in 2016. Of course, the circumstance of this one are slightly different than that it wasn't a case of Vince McMahon necessarily looking to elevate the mid-card belt by giving it to his top star. Rather, this one was a means of punishment for the big dog after he'd failed a drug test and got suspended for a period of time. Obviously then, this, combined with the cavalcade of boos Roman was getting every time he came through the curtain, signifying just how much fans didn't want to see him in the main event scene at that point, made the boss temporarily rethink things and pull back on the push of Reigns for a little while. And that meant, rather than chase the big prize, he'd spend the next year or so chasing smaller goals instead, with the first of these being the US title, which was then being held by Rusev. How would such attempts to win that belt play out for the future tribal chief? Well, at Clash of the Champions on September 25th of that year, he'd pinned the Bulgarian Brute to win the title once held by greats such as Harley Race, Terry Funk, and Ric Flair. How would his run go from there? Well, it was alright. But then to be fair to Roman, that was about the best that could have been hoped for him at this point, as with audiences largely disliking him, and the office having lost some faith in his ability to be the guy, the whole purpose of this reign was just to keep his head above water until he could be trusted enough to go back up to the main event scene again. And it's not as if he was buried down into the undercard at this point or anything. No, he still regularly got to have semi-important bouts against performers such as Kevin Owens and Chris Jericho, so he was still a featured act, even if he wasn't the main focus. That said, even when he lost this title to Jericho in January of 2017, it didn't mean he was welcomed back up to the top of the card right away. No, first he had to go through another run with a secondary belt, which happened in November of that year, when he became Intercontinental Champion for the first time. And as it happened, this victory officially made him a Grand Slam champion, as with it, he'd held both of the secondary prizes, as well as the World and Tag Team titles. Still, while that was quite an achievement, it wasn't really a huge focus at the time. No, the focus was making sure Reigns could push himself hard enough during this run so that he could get back to a point where WWE still felt he belonged to be in the long term. Yes, many fans were still booing him, but Roman did everything he could do to overcome this by having good bouts against the likes of Samoa Joe, Cesaro, and Jason Jordan over the months which followed. Hell, he'd even take part in a Shield reunion as a ways of giving the whole thing another added level of importance. And all this worked out so well for him that, by the time he dropped the gold to The Miz in January of 2018, he'd be ready to be inserted back into the main event scene. Of course, as we all know, since that point, Roman Reigns has proven all his detractors wrong and has become the biggest star in the entire wrestling industry, with him currently being in the midst of a 1,200-plus day run as undisputed WWE Universal Champion, the longest run anyone's had with a world title in WWE since Hulk Hogan in the mid-'80s. That said, if he wants to be the greatest world champion of all time, he still has a ways to go to beat Ric Flair. After all, this is a man who, even after winning the top prize at least 16 times across WWF, WCW, and the NWA in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, still wasn't above having a run with a secondary strap when in 2005, he himself became Intercontinental Champion.
When you write, your tone influences how readers respond. With Grammarly, just highlight your text and type how.
Now we know this wasn't exactly the Nature Boy at his peak, and that it really represented a thank you for all his years of service, as at this point he was reaching the end of his full-time in-ring career. But that doesn't mean Rick didn't do everything he could to make this one special, as after beating Carlito for the gold at September 18th's Unforgiven that year, he'd go on to have some pretty underrated defenses against not only Triple H, but also Edge and Shelton Benjamin too. Sure, it wasn't to the level of one of his runs with the NWA World's title back in the 80s when he was selling out arenas by taking on the likes of Dusty Rhodes, Sting, or Terry Funk, but for a man who was, by that time, well into his 50s, it was better than anyone could have hoped for, and proof of just how good Slick Rick was, even when he was going at half speed. And because of that, when he finally dropped the title to Shelton Benjamin on the February 20th, 2006 episode of Raw, it felt like it meant something, and allowed Benjamin to get a bit of a rub from the whole situation. Hell, this would be the last singles belt the Nature Boy ever won in his career, so for that reason alone, it should be remembered as it's highly unlikely we'll ever see him win another one again, unless it comes from the personal collection of his son-in-law, Conrad Thompson. But then, being a belt collector, Conrad probably has more titles than he knows what to do with, so he can likely afford to give one to Rick. In fact, we wouldn't be surprised if he was in possession of the old European title, the very title Shawn Michaels dropped down the card a little bit to win in 1997. Now, we say Shawn dropped down the card to win this one, but that isn't strictly true. No, if we're being totally honest, it couldn't be further from the truth. And the reason for that is because throughout 1997, HBK was neck and neck with Bret Hart for the role of top guy in all of WWF. So why did he feel the need to win the newly established European title at this point then? Was it because he wanted to help elevate it? Was it because Bret Hart already had the world title and he wanted to be like him? Come on, this is Shawn Michaels in 1997 we're talking about here. It was about pure spite. Yes, it's been well documented that at the UK-only pay-per-view, one night only, on September 20th of that year, the Heartbreak Kid used his political power to get the finish of his match with the British Bulldog changed so that he beat him for his belt in his home country. But at least he had a good run with the belt after this, right? Well, not exactly. In fact, we're not even entirely sure he defended it at all before losing it to his buddy Triple H in a farce of a match that December. And the reason for this is because the Texan never had any interest in the European strap. No, he was far more interested in winning Bret Hart's aforementioned world title instead. And for that reason then, this kind of killed any prestige the secondary prize had right out of the gate, as Shawn often outright mocked its value during his promos, meaning that as the Attitude Era came into being a few months later, it would be the prize sought after by those on the undercard, and nothing more. That's right, not every main eventer holding a secondary title has been a good thing in the long run. But while HBK pretty much buried the belt he was holding in 1997, the same couldn't be said for what his buddy did a few years later in 2001, as it was then Triple H took the Intercontinental title and made it feel like something of value again for a little while.
Dang,
okay, that's not entirely fair. After all, the Intercontinental belt still held a fair bit of value in 2001, as this was the period that the likes of Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle were fighting over it. But once those guys reached the main event level, they weren't exactly queuing up to go back and win the lesser prize. No, that job would be left to the Game. Why had he decided to do this? Well, this was the brief era of the two-man power trip, the period where the biggest star in the industry, Steve Austin, and best wrestler in the world, Triple H, teamed up as a heel act to absolutely dominate the WWF main event scene. And because the Rattlesnake was the world champion then, that meant it was up to his partner to control the secondary belt and make sure this remained in-house with them as well. Yes, this was maybe the last time until Daniel Bryan came along a decade and a half later that you could seriously make the argument the IC title was being held by the best out there. Really, it evoked the days of performers such as Macho Man Randy Savage and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat back when they were in possession of it. Sadly though, like with the two-man power trip as a whole, this run would be ultimately short-lived, as the day after he dropped it to Kane at May 20th, 2001's Judgment Day, the King of Kings suffered a catastrophic quad tear during a bout pitting him in Austin against Chris Jericho and Chris Benoit, with this putting him out of action for the better part of a year. But what of Kane, the man who beat him for the title? After all, he was a full-blown main eventer and former WWF champion at this point too. Well, like we said, back in 2001, the Intercontinental title still had some value, and that's why during the period he was arguably at this peak, the Big Red Machine went on a truly dominating run with this prize. That's right, it didn't matter who went up against him back then, Kane was going to make sure they were hurting come the end of the bout. Hell, the only way anyone managed to beat him at all at this point was via screwy means, as it took an interference spot from Diamond Dallas Page at the beginning of the invasion to ensure Albert was able to take the big man's gold away. Not that this stopped him from eventually winning that same belt back though, as the following autumn, he beat Chris Jericho to become a 2-time IC champion. And this time, he had an even better run, as it was the period he was defending it against the likes of Triple H, all while also holding on to the World Tag Team titles with the Hurricane. But what about his kayfabe brother, The Undertaker?
RVD.
What was he doing when Kane was making the Intercontinental strap his own? Well, as it happened, he was doing the same for another mid-card belt, with this one being the time he became the Hardcore Champion for a while.
Watch live sports with no hidden fees or long-term contracts.
Yes, the belt most commonly associated with the comedy segments of Crash Holly got a major boost of star power in late 2001, as this was when the Deadman decided he wanted to run with it. Why was that? Well, never one to be scared of giving back to those lower down on the pecking order than him, Mark Calloway felt that if the main event scene was being dominated by the likes of Steve Austin, Kurt Angle, and Chris Jericho, then he'd be best served at that time by doing something else in order to raise others up. And this meant defeating Rob Van Dam to win the Hardcore title for the first and only time, with him from there going on to have matches against anyone and everyone who wanted to step into his yard and have him make them famous. Of course, none of this would have meant much had it not led to the Phenom putting some young up-and-comer over in the end, though. And thankfully, he did just this, because after Maven, the winner of the first ever season of Tough Enough, got a shock elimination over the Deadman at the 2002 Royal Rumble, the pair would square off again on the February 5th episode of SmackDown, this time one-on-one, with the title on the line. Would Maven be able to shock the world for a second time and beat The Undertaker here? Of course he would. And now, with his job in elevating both the belt and the rookie done then, Mark Calloway was free to return to the main event picture when he went on to defend his WrestleMania streak against Ric Flair a couple of months later. But this wouldn't be the only time a top guy and former multiple-time world champion returned back to the mid-card of SmackDown in order to add some value to a secondary strap, because almost 2 decades later in 2018, it was Randy Orton's turn to do this when he became United States Champion. What was the story behind Randy's time trying to help elevate the mid-card towards the end of the 2010s? Well, by this time he was already a 14-time world champion and someone who was entering the downswing of his career, so it really didn't make any sense for him to be clogging up the main event scene anymore when you had guys like Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, Bray Wyatt, and Roman Reigns who were all more than up to the task. One purpose the Viper could still serve at that point, however, was to take the belt John Cena had done such a good job of elevating a few years prior and try to help get it back to that level. First, by winning it from Bobby Roode at that March's Fastlane pay-per-view. Then, once he'd done that, he'd be free to go ahead and have a series of bangers against a bunch of young, up-and-coming opponents where he could make them look like $1 million in the process. Except things didn't really work out this way in the end. No, instead, after holding on to the title for less than a month, Orton dropped it to Jinder Mahal at WrestleMania 34 on April 8, 2018, with this allowing him to do very little of note during the time he held it. So why was he booked to hold it at all then? Well, it did allow him to become a Grand Slam champion, a feat which had always evaded him until then. And on top of this, we can't entirely discount the possibility he was supposed to have a longer run, but that these plans got nixed once he got injured, with this injury eventually requiring him to take time off in May of that same year in order to get surgery. So even if this one was short and relatively uneventful, at the very least there was some kind of method to the madness here. But what about our next subject? Was there a method to him winning the Intercontinental Championship in 2012 after having had 3 separate runs with the top prize prior to that? Well, let's find out by looking at The Big Show. Now, this one is particularly interesting in that it wasn't as if Paul White was necessarily taking time away from the main event scene when he became IC champ for the first and only time. And given how little value that belt held back then, it wasn't as if he was elevating it to new heights by merely holding it. So the only reasons we can come up with for him winning it at all then are, 1, so he could get his token run and become a Grand Slam champion in the process, and 2, to keep him busy in between winning the World Heavyweight title 4 months before in December of 2011, and then again 6 months after in October of 2012. No other explanation seems to make sense. After all, why else would he have been booked to dethrone Cody Rhodes at WrestleMania 28 on April 1st of that latter year? especially when the American Nightmare was doing everything he could to bring some prestige back to the title,
Not
including
the
bringing
American
back the
Nightmare.
classic 80s
Yeah,
design.
that's Dashing Bloody
No,
Rogues.
we have to put this one down to the Big Show getting a metaphorical
Or
gold watch for all
undashing
his time with the
Bloody
company up until that point. And in the end,
Because
maybe
he had
this
the
was
mask
reason
on.
enough back in 2012. Either way, as we've shown today, he wasn't the first main eventer to win a mid-card title, and he certainly won't be the last.
Alright, thank y'all for watching. We got one more video to do. I'm gonna see you on that video. We out. So before we get out, let's check Kick. Nothing on Kick. Twitch. Nobody even tuned in from Twitch.